Hello everyone and welcome to another dataset session with Learn at Knowstar. In today's session, we are going to take a look at the pivot stage in Datastage. And we're going to take an example of horizontally pivoting the data, which means converting a set of columns into multiple rows. We have also the option to vertically pivot the data, and we can also use the same stage, which is the pivot enterprise stage, to perform that. But we'll take a look at that example in one of our future videos. So let's get started for today. So we are going to work with the sales data. I have already configured the sequential file stage. So let's just go and view the data. When we view the data, we can see that we have different regions and then we have multiple columns indicating the sales for one particular year. So for example, we have the region Northeast and we have multiple columns, sales 2010 till sales 2020, and which basically means that you have the sales for 2010 in this column, you have sales for 2011 in this column, and so on. Now what we want to achieve is to convert these different columns into multiple rows. So you will have these sales amount for the different years coming as rows instead of coming in a single row in different columns. So to make it easier to understand, we basically want to achieve something like this. So here if we see, we have this region Southwest and we have a particular year and we have the sales corresponding to that year 2010. If we go down over here, we will see that there's another record for Southwest which is corresponding to the year 2016, and we have the sales corresponding to that particular year. So this is what we want to achieve, and this is known as horizontal pivoting. Now this can be easily achieved by just adding the pivot stage. So go to your palette, go to the processing category and go to your pivot enterprise stage. Now just drag and drop it to your designer window and then just put an output link. Now go to the pivot enterprise stage, double click on it and you will enter the stage editor window. The stage editor window, you just need to configure a few things. There are different things that you need to configure for vertical pivoting, different for horizontal pivoting. So we are going to focus on the horizontal pivoting in this video. So the first thing that we want to do is add a pivot index. So just go over here where you can see the pivot index and just click on it. And there would be a column added which would be known as the pivot index. It is basically the index for the column for which the data would be pivoted. So basically an index would be created for all the sales columns that we had in our input. We'll see how it works when we take a look at the output. Now next what we want to do is add one more column which is something called sales. So what we want to do now is basically put all the data from the different sales column into a single sales column in the output. So we are going to define that column and then we are going to define the data type for that column. So let's just define this as integer, and then we have to go to the derivation and define the derivation for this column, which would basically define the columns which would be horizontally pivoted to generate data for this column. So double click on this. Once you double click on this, this dialog box would appear where you would be able to see all the columns from your input. So you just need to select all the sales column and the data from all these different columns should be converted into rows. So you have 10 or 11 columns over here. So you should now be getting 11 rows for each corresponding to one of these columns. So we are just going to select these columns and then just go over here and add these columns. Okay, so we have added region. Region is nothing, we want the region to be in the output, but we do not want the data from that particular column to be pivoted into the sales column in our output. So we are going to take that away. So we are just going to select region and go over here and take that away from our derivation. So now we have all the columns over here. So now let's just go to OK and say OK over here. All the other properties that you're seeing over here on this box, like the array size and the group by and pivot, so we are not really concerned with them for the horizontal pivoting. So we are just going to ignore them for now, and now we are going to go to the output tab and go to the mappings. So for mappings, we want the region column and we want the sales column. We want the region and the sales column, and we'll also take the pivot index and just drag and drop all these to the output. So we have 3 columns in the output for now, which are the region, the pivot index, and the sales. So let's just say OK and come out. And now we are going to go back to our development and debug palette, and we are going to select the peak stage. So we are just going to verify what is the output that we have got after whatever calculation and pivoting we defined over here. So the best stage which I most frequently use is the peak stage, because then in that case we do not really need to define a data set or a sequential file or a file name. We can just quickly sample the output data and check if our derivations or whatever logic we have implemented is correct. So it's a very powerful development or debug stage which we can use. So we are just going to drag and drop this onto our window over here, and then we are going to go and save this job, and then we are going to go and compile this job. Okay, so job successfully compiled with no errors. The next stage, the next step for us is to go and run this job. So we are going to run this job. Okay, and this job is run pretty fast. So now we are going to go to the director and see the output from the peak stage. So we cannot just go right click and do a view data. We have to check the director log for this. So this is our director log, and we can see the data over here. So let's just paste it to a notepad. So we can see that for this particular region, which is the northeast region, we have got sales. So this is the value of the sales amount, and then we have got a pivot index. So what it has basically done is that it has pivoted the column values into multiple rows, and instead of having a column header, so instead of telling that this particular value of sales is for 2010, this particular value of sales is for 2011, and so on, instead of pivoting the column headers, it has generated a pivot index. So now the challenge over here is that we have to identify which column header corresponds to which pivot index. Now, if it is a finite number of column headers that we have, and we are sure that it is not going to change, we know that it is going to be 10 headers always, and they would have the same name which would correspond to the same column, then we can create manually some file which would be based on the same pivot index that we just generated, and it would basically tell you that pivot index 0 corresponds to sales underscore 2010, pivot index 1 corresponds to sales underscore 2011, and so on, and then you can do a join and pick up the column headers. So in that way you would know that you have data for which year in which row, because right now as we have the data in this form, it would not really help us because we cannot identify exactly which columns data has gone into which row, right? So that is the next step that you need to perform over here. So it's not simply going and using the pivot stage. You need to have your column headers defined somewhere so that you can make sense of this data. So as I said, there are multiple ways of doing it. You can manually have that file and then do a lookup and derive the column headers. If let's say you want to do it dynamically, so you want to create an automated process that just strips off the header from your file or the column information, metadata information, and then generates a pivot enterprise stage index, and then you can do a lookup or a join based on that index. So that can be done again in multiple ways. You can do it through Unix or you can do it through Datastage itself. So let's, for the sake of this example, do it through Datastage. So what we're going to do next is basically, I'm just going to copy this whole derivation, this whole design that we just did for pivoting the data from the detailed records of our sales input file. Now we are going to do a pivoting on the column header. So we are just going to copy this structure and paste it over here. Now the next step for us is going to be generating that header information. So for that we have to go to the job properties. Okay, before that let's just go and rename this. So let's just rename it to header of annual sales, and then let's configure the sequential file stage. So we have to change the name over here to head annual sales. The structure would remain the same. And the next thing that you need to make sure, because now we are deriving the header information, so we need to read the first column as a data record and not as a column name record. So we are going to go to this option, which is first line is column names equal to true. We are going to go over here and change it to false. Now that we have configured our header sequential file stage, the next step is to go and generate that header file. So for that, we have to go to the job properties, and then what we are going to do is we are going to write a before job script, Unix script or Unix command that will strip the header from the data file or the source file that we have, and then we would read that header information in our header sequential file that we just created. So to do that, I'm just going to do a head -1, which would basically extract the first record from our source file, and the first record in our source file is the column header information. So, and then you have to give your file name, and then we are just going to override this every time. So just give a greater than symbol, and then let's create a file that we're going to name as the header_annual_sales.csv file. So this is a file that we are going to read in the second flow that we just created, and we're going to pivot on the header or the column names. Now if you go to the pivot enterprise stage and double click on it, so this is where we will land, and you can see that all the derivations and everything is already defined, which is because we copied the pivot enterprise stage from the earlier flow. So we really do not need to change anything. We still want to basically pivot all these columns into a single column in the output. But now this time, instead of calling it the sales column, we want to call it the year column. Because now what is happening is that we are only pivoting the header record, which has the column names. So what we are pivoting is sales_2010, sales_2011, sales_2012, and so on. And that is basically the yearly sales for us. So we are going to change the name over here, go to the output. Now in the output tab, we have the sales column from the earlier derivation. So we are just going to right click and we are just going to delete this. Next thing we are going to do is pull the year column into our output. So we have the year column now. Now we have done this, all this flow, we have designed this flow just to identify the column names or the year names based on the pivot index. So we really do not need the region over here. So we are just going to right click and go to delete column and delete this column. Right, so this is all we need. We are just going to say OK and come out of it. And we have a peak stage appended to this as well, so that we can just quickly check the results. So next thing that we're going to do is again save this job and then go to the compilation. So job is successfully compiled. Just close it. Then just run this job. And once you run this job, we can go back to the director and check that what we have got in the output. So we can see the peak stage output over here. Let's again copy it to a notepad to make it more clear. So now we can see that a pivot index in the same fashion has been generated. And now this time, instead of having the sales figure, we have just one, basically we have just one row which has been converted into 11 rows. One row from the source which has been converted into 11 rows in the output, one row for each column, and the values in that column are the year headers. So now you have 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, and so on, right? And you have the pivot index corresponding to that. Okay, now since we have got what we wanted to achieve, what we are going to now do is remove the peak stage. And now we are going to go to the processing stage and include a join stage over here. Okay, so just connect these to the join stages and we can name it appropriately. So this is going to be our sales record. This is going to be our header record. And then we are just going to put the final destination stage as a sequential file stage as well. Alright, now let's go back to the join stage, double click on it, and now we have to define the join key, which is going to be a pivot index, and go to the output, to the mapping, and just now we just need to take the region, the year, and the sales to the output. So just select all these columns and drag and drop them to the output. We do not need the pivot index because we have already performed the inner join on the pivot index. Let's go over here and say OK. All right, and now we have just executed this job. So I saved this job, I compiled this job, and I executed this job. And if I take a look at the data now, you can see that based on the pivot index, it joined the data. And now instead of having the pivot index over here, it has fetched the year, the corresponding year for which we have the data. So we have achieved the objective of converting the data from a set of columns into different rows. Now this is a practical situation and you would encounter this many times. So horizontal pivoting is good to know. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning, that we can also do vertical pivoting using the same pivot enterprise stage. So I will make a video on that later on. For now, this is how you can perform the horizontal pivoting. I hope you liked the video and found this useful. If you did, then please do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, because we will be posting many more videos on Datastage, SQL, Unix, and other data and BI analytics tools. So stay tuned. See you next time. Goodbye.